What's up? So today we are going to discuss, is it safe to own real estate in Los Cabos as a foreigner? And you're not going to be hearing it from me, you're going to be hearing it from a prominent real estate attorney in Los Cabos, Eduardo Tapia. Very excited to get a minute of his time today. Eduardo, he has a law degree from Mexico City, then he had a master's degree at University of Texas. He's been practicing law here for over 20 years. He's also the president of the Mexican Bar Association for Baja California Sur. So I'm really excited to be able to ask some questions to somebody who knows a lot more about the subject than I do. So let's get into it. All right, Eduardo, is it safe to own in Mexico? And what is the fideicomiso?
The short answer is yes. Obviously, you are needing to have proper counsel in place simply to avoid the common pitfalls. As far as the fideicomiso or trust, which would be the English translation, it's a vehicle to basically get around the constitutional restriction for foreigners to own in fee simple outright ownership of realty. That restriction goes through 30 miles of coastline or 50 miles from the border. In the Los Cabos region, obviously, if you pick a spot, we're within 30 miles of the coastline around the whole county, as well as, for example, La Paz. So, per the Article 27 prohibition, the foreign investment law enables foreigners to have beneficial title through a trust, and the trustee, out of necessity per statute, has to be a bank. That bank would hold legal title to the realty while the foreigner has beneficial status of that realty. Basically, it gets the enjoyment, the possession of the property throughout the 50-year lifespan of the trust.
Okay, Eduardo, we spoke recently and seemed to be like a lot of horror stories with foreigners buying real estate here and really not going through the proper intermediaries or hiring the correct people. So, how do you avoid pitfalls when buying real estate in Mexico or in Cabo? And what are some of the biggest mistakes you see foreigners make?
First off, the most common mistake that foreigners have in connection with the acquisition of realty is assuming that the legal framework is the same in the States, which is based on common law, and Mexico, which is a civil law jurisdiction. So, with that in mind, the process is different in the sense that when you buy realty, especially with, for example, here in Cabo, you need the trust, you need the trustee, which is the bank, to serve as the trustee for holding those the legal title to the property. So what happens is, under common law, there's not an obligation for the seller to record his or her title in a central registry. So you really don't know, for example, in the States or Canada or the UK, that the person who's selling that particular piece of property is actually the rightful owner. So you basically go through a process of a title insurance, where if something is defective in title, if there's a cloud on title which you could not have known because, again, there's not a centralized tract or index registry. Some counties do follow what we have in the States called the Torrent system, but those are the minority of jurisdictions. So you obtain the title insurance simply to say, look, if someone has better title than you can basically go to the title insurance company and get your money back. With that in mind, in Mexico, those safeguards are not necessarily in place with the title insurance as traditionally in common law jurisdictions. Recently, I'm going from 20 years, from let's say the year 2000 to today, there are title insurance companies that are issuing proper title insurance policies. But the good thing about Mexico, under the civil law jurisdiction, that we are basically a culture that is used to having difficulties in the transaction. So we have a lot more safeguards in place than you would have in the States or in Canada or the UK for that matter. One of the main factors in acquiring property in Mexico is it has to go through a notary public. The notary public in Mexico is different from the notary public, for example, in the United States, where you pay a processing fee and you basically have an oath and you get a seal from the Secretary of State, and basically you're notary public. You do not need specific licensure. in Mexico, you need to be a licensed attorney, and there are a specific number of positions available as a notary public that are granted by the state. So you have to pass a certain exam, and you have to be designated by the government. For example, in Cabo, there are just over 32 notary publics in the whole state. By comparison, Mexico City, which is the largest city in Mexico, has 250 notaries, and they are all designated by population. So with the notary public who has to have the only person who can transfer title under Mexican law, being the notary public, a bonded official with obviously the credentials as an attorney, you have that safeguard in place. The second safeguard you have is all the public deeds regarding realty have to necessarily be recorded. You have to have your seller record his or her title in order for her to sell. With that said, the record owner has to match what we call a certificate of no liens, which is a certificate to do two things. One is to confirm if there are no clouds on title, if there's a lien, if there's a security interest on there, if there's a mortgage, any type of security interest. And also to see if the person who is selling that piece of property, in particular the unit that's built out, is actually the owner of record. So you have that to go on as well. So if you go to the property registry and you have a different name or entity selling that piece of property to the person that you're dealing with, then those are the questions you need to be asking. So with the notary public in place, with the obligatory index system, the recording system in place, you have the additional, let's say, safeguard through title insurance. So it is very safe as far as that transaction goes. The problem sometimes goes to trust. Mexico, as a Latin American culture, is not, let's say, very keen on openness and transparency. Unfortunately, that's why we have all these safeguards in place, because we've had a lot of history regarding that. For example, revolutions sometimes take place because of the lack of certainty of all these investments in real property. 100 years ago, that was one of the things in agrarian reform that took place in the early 20th century. So yes, there are many mistakes that can be avoided, but if you can have proper counsel in place to guide you through the process, and obviously that counsel will liaison with the notary public. The notary public does not want to risk his or her credential as a notary public because it's a very important designation. You only get that, and it's basically a lifetime appointment. So you have that to go on with the importance of being a notary public. So you really don't want to compromise that through, let's say, shady deals. So you have that one also to bank on regarding that. But if you have all these transactions in place and say, well, what can I do to avoid this? First of all, any type of seller that says, hey, you need to give me money directly, you kind of have to frown on that. You want to be sure, first of all, you do your due diligence, and then to talk about the delivery of money, because you don't want to leverage away that power as a buyer.
Okay, Eduardo, let's say you have somebody that really wants to diversify into Mexico and they're looking at maybe buying 5, 6, 7 properties and they're not going to live in them. This is all investment properties. The SRL is equivalent to the LLC. When does it make sense to set up an SRL?
Yes, the LLC, the limited liability company, has the partnership status for transparency under U.S. tax laws, and the Sociedad Responsabilidad Limitada, SRL, qualifies as such. That's not the only entity you can actually set up as a foreigner. You can have foreign investment in an SA, Sociedad Anónima, which is akin to a corporation. But obviously, when you have that specific investor coming from abroad and saying, I want to have a sizable investment, and not necessarily for residential purposes, but basically, let's say in that light, a commercial enterprise, you would be wanting to set up a company to have basically the holding of those different units. You can have that in order to be more cost effective, because you can set up a trust individually for each of the units you're going to be buying. And that makes sense if there are, again, you're going to be living in at least one of the units, because there are also tax consequences regarding holding more than one, because you can only live in one unit at a time. So there is a special tax credit when it comes to selling the property down the road for income tax purposes under Mexican law. So if you have these different units, you can certainly group them together in a company that could be the SRL, and basically hold the assets in all these units and say, well, this company has X, Y, and Z assets. For purposes of like the single purpose investment vehicle, you can also have the trust, which would be a bit more expensive because it's not, let's say, the normal residential trust that we normally have as far as just a one unit at a time deal. There are trustees that can serve as such under a administration trust that is a bit more complex and can hold title to several units under that legal title ownership through the trustee. But the trust would be an administration trust or even a business trust, fideicomiso empresarial. But those trusts have sizable fees because the bank is going to be doing not a whole lot more, but certainly more than what it does with regards to a residential trust, which basically is next to nothing, just charging every year a fee. But that's what you need to have in order to have proper title under the transfer of title deed. So yes, you can certainly set up a company, the entity like the SRL, like the SA, the corporation. You can have the administration trust hold title jointly through their units, and for example, also a business trust. With that in mind, then you can say, okay, let's have title to these 6 or 7 units, and then at the point of sale, because let's say you have raw land and you want to develop the raw land, and then you come in and you say, okay, let's build out a certain tract of land with X, Y, and Z units. You can certainly have, let's say, like a corporation to hold title to that, or the trustee, and you can instruct the trustee through instruction letters saying, I want this unit to go to this person, and at the point of sale, you can certainly go into different areas. But yeah, there are a number of ways you can do that. But it is recommended because you have the ability through the corporation or through the company, the SRL, to better, let's say, serve the investment needs that you would be seeking through that.
All right, Eduardo. Get a lot of people in Cabo that don't necessarily know much about it, and for me, it's pretty much a younger place in Mexico, and I believe there's a lot of growth that'll be happening here in maybe the next 10, 15, 20 years. Where do you see Los Cabos in the next 10 years?
As with all predictions, that's certainly a tricky question because I may be wrong. I've been in Cabo for almost 20 years now. In December, it's going to be 20 years the first time I came over. And it's obviously a different city than it was 20 years ago. 10 years from now, I believe Cabo will be better consolidated for a medium-sized market. We will basically be more institutionalized with our processes. We're not necessarily going to be very, let's say, local in nature, in the sense that we can certainly gather our experience because we will be better connected, not only to the mainland, which we call the rest of Mexico, but also to the States with better communications throughout the region. So we have good land here, we have good water, but those certainly will be factors that we need to tie in because tenement of land, even though it's land that is available, land that is outside of the proper area of Los Cabos and even La Paz is still under what we call common property or ejido land. So we need to have proper transactions to have those ejidos, those common lands, basically under Article 27 of the Constitution. There's a certain group of people that you're granted X land to cultivate, but we know that it's not going to be something that's very important for people here. But basically, the expanse of the land is a good factor. I believe there will be a corridor that will be expanding northward towards Los Cabos, towards La Paz, from both sides, from the Sea of Cortez side, which we call the East Cape, it's always going to be expanding to that region. I believe there will be a better access highway from here from the Los Cabos airport to the area of La Ribera and up to Los Barriles, which is kind of halfway between here and La Paz. So with that in place, there are certain marinas that are already up and running in that region. So that area will be, I think, flourishing nicely. It's a very beautiful area, and we also have the Cabo Pulmo area that is protected area under state and federal government laws. With that in mind, the Pacific side is the area also that has already a 4-lane highway that connects La Paz to Los Cabos. So the developments are now, because I guess the sizable properties for developments have been snatched up, so they will continue northward. And it's going to be expanded probably north of Pescadero, currently, which is about almost an hour north of Cabo, up to Todos Santos, which is midway between La Paz and Cabo. So yeah, I think it's going to be a good spot. I think it's one of the better spots in all of Mexico as far as expansion goes. I believe that security is key. We have maintained proper levels of security. Our geography insulates us with things that are not necessarily commonplace in other parts of Mexico. Here we have that to go on. We have that to bank on. We have that to say, well, at least we are separated enough from the mainland to not participate in all of its problems, and we are close enough to other areas such as the state. So hopefully those predictions come true, and this will be a hotspot for many years to come.
So our previous conversation, I was very interested to find out that Cabo's sitting on a gold mine, both figuratively and literally. There's a lot of gold in the mountains here, and you said something about the mining companies wanting to come in almost every 3 years. So I was just curious if you could elaborate on the fact that there is like opportunity for here and how Cabo keeps putting that off, and hopefully that they would never really come in, because I just think that would be detrimental to a lot of people here.
Basically, as the saying goes, there is gold in the mountains, and yes, especially Canadian companies have expressed an interest year in year out regarding the presence of gold and mining. Many years ago in El Triunfo, which is actually properly the municipality of La Paz, akin to a county, so it's more towards the area of La Paz, but that whole area of El Triunfo used to be for gold and copper. That said, in the 20th century, it basically grew out its production cycle. It got more expensive to extract gold, so El Triunfo kind of constituted like a ghost town, basically, after that. But it is a certainty that there are various interests in the region to exploit that mining process. The problem is it's located next to Sierra de la Laguna, which is basically our natural aquifer, our resource center for water. It comes from the mountains downwards, and it feeds all these different natural wells, underground water system of Los Cabos. So even though they say it might be safe, I believe the process of fracking, the process of extracting gold and silver and other minerals from those regions will be detrimental to the health of the population of Los Cabos. And years ago, it was almost a given that they were going to be granting a concession. Under Mexican law, you need to have a concession by the Mexican government because under Article 27, the nation of Mexico owns the subsoil, the subsurface. So the minerals, everything that's extracted needs to have the government authorization through a concession. These concessions, because of the investment involved, are many years long, maybe 30, 50 years. So with that in mind, there are several civil society organizations that have strived to protect that area and have, basically mineral rights and extraction off limits. I don't know if they will continue to be successful as they have, because there's a lot of pressure also on the government because of the revenues that the mineral extraction might represent. But I believe that the health and the safety of the Los Cabos population, and that also of La Paz, is key and paramount to avoid just on the monetary side of things, the extraction. So yeah, there is that part. I believe the gold mine is going to be rather towards fishing. We have great fishing in the region, so it is a gold mine for many things, for tourist development as it has been, hotels, real estate, golf, those types of things should be our gold mine.
Okay, Eduardo, after talking to you previously, you mentioned that you would much rather have somebody come to you proactively about buying a property or an investment here in Los Cabos, because generally, when the people come to you with the problem, you can help them, but there's no guarantee. So, can you talk about the importance of being proactive and going to seeking counsel from somebody like yourself before, and some of the nightmares that might come up in the litigation process?
Basically, it is important to approach counsel as you would a doctor. You obviously want to have preventive measures in place rather than corrective measures in place. Why? Because once the problem happens, and it's basically our cup of tea. Attorneys, we live in other people's problems, and we basically make our living off of those problems. But I'm much more of the idea that when you want to invest, you want to make good on the returns that you've made in other areas of your life, and you have something to go on as far as making that investment, those monies that you accrued in other areas of your life, and that you want to invest in Los Cabos. You do need to approach proper counsel. It could be me, it could be a colleague of mine of the Mexico Bar Association. Basically, the reason I say the Mexican Bar Association is because at least you have a groundwork association for all the things that you need to have for counsel. You have to have competence, you have to have ethical standards. And you also need to be aware that the attorneys cannot guarantee results. It's, for example, when it comes to litigation, it's not necessarily a coin toss. There are certain things you can do to better protect the position of your client in a litigation scenario, but it is certainly much easier to avoid those things to begin with. But when things go south, as they say, we can be assured that at least when it comes to those types of problems, we can give an honest assessment to our clients, and we need to explain that in Mexico, we are a very formalistic legal culture, so everything is still needs to be in writing, documented. So that takes a lot of time. So litigation is something that I would not recommend going, but I've done it, and I currently am involved with several clients in litigation to protect their rights, but it takes a long time. So I'd rather have them avoid just common mistakes that could certainly be avoided with proper advice in the first place. So when you mentioned the proactive part, yes, you need to be proactive in the protective nature of those investments. And same thing as if you go to a doctor, the doctor says, well, if you didn't smoke for 30 years in your life, your lungs would be better. Well, you kind of knew that. You couldn't avoid it, let's say, but it's kind of like that. So you need to have like an open mind when it comes to saying, well, we need to be not necessarily super fast with our advice. We need to structure the deals so that at least it's protected as much as we can. There are no things that are perfect in this life, but we can certainly make sure that the things that need to be done before we get into these problems can be done to mitigate the risk when it comes to litigation. So with that in mind, I'd rather also mediate the matter and even possibly go to arbitration. Those are the areas I think that can be expanded upon going forward.
I want to ask you about the most expensive residential real estate that has been purchased in Mexico. I believe it has happened in Los Cabos, and if I'm not mistaken, you were involved with it. Is there any details you can give about like where it was and and how that in fact is the most expensive residential real estate sold in Mexico.
It's a kind of a funny story because that transaction did take place, and I was counsel for the seller. It was the year 2013, almost 2014, and my client had a house that did not have a sign for sale on the property. It's in the El Dorado subdivision, subcondominium actually, of Los Cabos. It's kind of halfway between San Jose del Cabo and Cabo San Lucas. And in that process of time, I was helping him out actually in the middle of a divorce. And so he was trying basically to avoid the proceeds of the sale going to the ex-wife. And so with those things in place, he was out at the house, by himself, and the would-be buyer came in with a girlfriend. The would-be buyer was from Russia, and cute girlfriend by his side, and they asked my client if they could take a look at the house. And I said, fine. So they went into the house, which is kind of a nice way of saying it was like a small hotel. And it was merged, two lots, beachfront lots, beautiful. And they looked at the house, and the Russian businessman said, "I really like your house." And my client said, "Great, I like that you like my house. Is it for sale?" And my client said no, which was technically incorrect because it was already listed. But he said, no, it's not for sale. And the Russian businessman said, well, everything is for sale. And my client said, well, what are you talking about? Yeah, I really like to buy a house. Okay, so what do you want from me? Do you want to give a number? Sure, okay. Well, let's say this. If you give me $45 million, the house is yours. And the Russian business person didn't blink. They shook on it. And that was that. The day after, we had a conference call. And I was in that conference call provided with a hypothetical question. Eduardo, what would happen if someone would come into my house and offered to buy the house for $45 million? I said, well, that would be a big problem because of taxes, because your base, is not anywhere near 45. And I asked them if there was someone in the vicinity asking about it, and with those numbers. They didn't say yes, they didn't say no. But the next day I got an email and said, Eduardo, yes, we have a person, they are interested, and that's the number. So I started working with those numbers, and it was obviously a difficult transaction because of simply just the amount of funds that are going to be transferred. With a house, it was not really worth it. It was not worth anywhere near 45. But it was kind of a thing that the Russian with the girlfriend said, I want the house. And no, he did get the house, and it was a very fast close, and it was obviously 2014, right around the time when the Sochi Olympics was taking. Yeah, it was right around that time, and my client was kind of saying, "Well, I feel I've been pushed around by Mr. Putin in this transaction." And I said, "No, we're doing well, but we obviously had to structure that." So yes, at the time, it was the most expensive transaction in the history of Mexico for a single-family residential dwelling. Years later, like 2 years later, George Clooney put his house up for sale, and I believe that I was not party to that transaction. He wanted 50. I know he didn't get it, so I don't know what that house traded for. But yeah, for purposes of record breaking sales, imagine one house for 45 that it was not worth it, but he got it, and it was a nice deal.
Thank you for your time, Eduardo. Learned a ton, and just want to make sure anybody who's watching this that would be looking for any sort of legal advice, specifically in regards to real estate and owning real estate as a foreigner, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
You're most welcome, Fletcher. We are Located in San Jose del Cabo. Our offices are in Plaza Peninsula. It's actually right next to the only Starbucks with a drive-through. And you could reach me via email. The website is jetslaw, jetzlaw.com. And the email is info@jetslaw.com. So drop me a line when you can, and I'll be glad to help. Thanks.